Everyone thinks the American silver made Spain the richest power on earth. In reality, the treasure was the instrument of its impoverishment, mortgaged before it landed, drained straight through Castile to foreign creditors, and so vast that it quietly wrecked the Spanish economy from the inside. There is a mountain in Bolivia that 16th century Spanish clerks described, without much exaggeration, as being made of silver. They called it Cerro Rico, the rich hill. For roughly 100 years after 1545, it produced more silver than any other place on the planet, and the empire that owned it kept running out of money. Not once. The Spanish crown stopped paying its debts in 1557, again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. Historians who tally these things put the total at 13 sovereign defaults between 1500 and 1900, more than any other state in that span. Sit with the shape of that for a second. The richest empire in the world could not cover its own bills. It controlled the largest supply of precious metal any government had ever held, and it spent 2 centuries stumbling from one bankruptcy to the next. You know the first half of this story: conquistadors, treasure galleons, a mountain of silver. That is where most tellings stop, with Spain gilded and terrifying. What gets left out is the second half, where the silver actually went, and why the biggest windfall in history left the country that received it poorer than the neighbors who didn't. This is a story about a curse that arrived disguised as a miracle. Start with the treasure, because the scale is the part that makes everything after it so strange. The silver was found, according to the story that survived, by a man named Diego Hualpa, an indigenous herder who is supposed to have noticed metal gleaming in the ground while lighting a fire against the Andean cold. Whatever the exact circumstances, by 1545 Spanish authorities knew what was inside the mountain. A year later, they hit a second lode far to the north, at Zacatecas in Mexico. The two strikes together turned a modest colonial enterprise into the largest flow of money the world had ever seen. The numbers are still debated, which tells you something. One respected estimate puts Potosi's output between 1545 and 1800 at around 45,000 metric tons of silver. Count the whole Spanish-American haul across the colonial centuries, and you reach something closer to 150,000 tons. During the boom decades, roughly 1575 to 1635, Potosi alone is thought to have produced close to half the silver mined anywhere on Earth. At its peak, the mines were yielding something like 9 million pesos a year, more than every other silver mine on the planet put together. The town that grew on the mountain's flank became one of the biggest cities in the world. By the early 17th century, Potosi held around 160,000 people, rivaling London or Seville, 4 kilometers up in thin, brutal air where almost nothing grows. The Spanish had a phrase for anything of unimaginable worth. They said it was worth a Potosi. The mint down in the city stamped the silver into coins called reales de a ocho, pieces of 8. They became the first genuinely global currency, spent in Seville and Manila and the ports of China, and they are the direct ancestor of the United States dollar. One traveler in the 1670s described the coins heaped on the mint floor and trodden underfoot like worthless dirt. Getting the metal out was another matter. The rich surface ore ran out fast, and after that the silver had to be pulled from lower-grade rock using mercury, which bonds to silver and lets you separate it. Contemporaries called the pairing of Andean silver with mercury from the nearby Huancavelica mines a marriage made in heaven. It was heaven for the accountants. The mercury poisoned the workers who handled it, and there were a lot of workers, because the crown revived an Inca labor draft called the mita and used it to force indigenous men into the shafts on rotation. Modern researchers estimate that refining at Potosi released something on the order of 39,000 tons of mercury vapor over the colonial period. The blessing had a body count from the first day, and the crown took its cut off the top. A flat 20% tax on all mined metal, the quinto real, the royal fifth, skimmed before anyone else saw a coin. On paper, the King of Spain had the most reliable income stream in Europe. He should have been untouchable. He was the most indebted man on the continent. To understand why, you have to go back to a rigged election. In 1519, the throne of the Holy Roman Empire came open. It was not inherited. 7 German electors chose the new emperor, and in practice that meant they auctioned their votes. 2 men bid, Francis I of France and Charles of Habsburg, already King of Spain. Charles won, and he won because he could borrow more. The bribes came to roughly 852,000 florins. About 2/3 of that, some 543,000 florins, came from a single banker in Augsburg named Jakob Fugger, with the rest made up by the Welser family and a few Italian houses. Fugger did not think of this as charity. 4 years later, with the debt unpaid, he wrote to Charles, by then the most powerful ruler in Christendom, and reminded him, in plain terms, that without Fugger's money there would have been no crown, and that he would like to be paid now. It is one of the great dunning letters in history, a merchant sending an invoice to a man who ruled half the world. That is the machine Philip II inherited when Charles abdicated and split his empire. Spain, the Netherlands, the Italian possessions, the American mines, and the bill. Charles left his son a debt of around 36 million ducats and an annual deficit of roughly 1 million more. Philip walked into the richest inheritance in Europe, already owing years of his own income before he'd spent a coin. Here is the thing the treasure did to that situation. It didn't fix it, it made the borrowing possible. The Spanish state ran on two kinds of debt, and the difference matters. The long-term kind was called a juro, essentially a government bond paying steady interest, secured against tax revenue. Ordinary, boring, sustainable. The dangerous kind was the asiento, a short-term, high-interest loan from bankers, arranged when the king needed cash immediately, which was always. The bankers who supplied it were first the Germans, the Fuggers and Welsers, and later, increasingly, the Genoese, who spent the better part of a century as the crown's financiers. The asientos had a feature that should make your stomach drop. They were frequently secured not against silver Spain already had, but against silver still crossing the Atlantic. The king borrowed today against a fleet that hadn't sailed yet. Each treasure convoy, the flota, was effectively mortgaged before it left harbor. When a fleet came in late, or came in light, or got taken, the payments seized up and the crown stopped paying. That is what a Spanish bankruptcy actually was. Not a mine running dry, a cash flow crisis in a state that was borrowing against next year's shipment to cover last year's war. And the wars never stopped. Philip fought the Ottomans in the Mediterranean and the Protestant Dutch in the north, where a revolt that began in the 1560s hardened into a war of independence that lasted 80 years and swallowed money by the shipload. When the tax income and the silver couldn't keep up, Philip did the only thing left. He suspended payments and forced his bankers to renegotiate, converting their short-term loans into long-term bonds at worse terms. He did it in 1557. The bankers were locked out of crown lending for the better part of 9 years. He did it again in 1560. Then came 1575, the big one. The crown suspended payments on around 14.6 million ducats of debt, roughly 2 years of total royal revenue, and the shock ran straight through the banking houses of Genoa. For a moment, the whole apparatus of Spanish credit simply stopped. It took until 1577 to patch back together. Now, you'd expect bankers to run. They didn't. They kept lending, default after default, and the reason is, the least romantic fact in this whole story, it was profitable. Estimates of what the lenders actually earned across Philip's reign land north of 10% a year, even accounting for the times they got stiffed. The defaults weren't a glitch in the relationship, they were a routine feature of it, priced in from the start. The king needed money more than the bankers needed safety, and both sides knew it. The silver, meanwhile, was doing something to Spain that nobody had a word for yet. Follow a single silver bar. It's dug out of Cerro Rico by a Mita laborer, refined with mercury, stamped into coins, loaded onto the flota, sailed to Seville, unloaded at the Royal House of Trade, taxed, and then handed almost immediately to a Genoese banker in settlement of a loan the king took out 2 years ago to pay soldiers in Flanders. The coin barely touches Spanish soil. It pauses in Castile long enough to be counted. That is the first mechanism. A huge share of the treasure never funded a Spanish farm, workshop, road, or school. It passed through the country like water through a pipe, on its way to creditors in Genoa and Antwerp, and to armies abroad. Spain was the throat the money went down, not the stomach that digested it. The second mechanism is subtler, and it's the one the man who first mapped it spent his career proving. His name was Earl J. Hamilton, an American economist who in 1934 published a book with the very dry title American Treasure and the Price Revolution in Spain, 1501 to 1650. Hamilton did something nobody had done. He went into the Spanish archives and reconstructed, year by year, both the bullion arriving at Seville and the prices of ordinary goods across Spain. He more or less invented quantitative economic history doing it. What he found was inflation, slow by our standards, savage by theirs. Across the 16th century, prices in Spain roughly tripled. That sounds mild, until you remember these were societies where prices barely moved across a person's entire lifetime. The cause, Hamilton argued, was the silver itself. When you flood an economy with money faster than it makes actual goods, each coin buys less. Too much silver chasing too few things. And here is where the blessing turns on its owner. Spanish prices rose faster than prices in France, England, and Holland. That made Spanish wine, cloth, and iron expensive, and foreign goods cheap by comparison. So Spaniards bought imports, and foreigners stopped buying Spanish. The country's own silk and wool industries, thriving in 1500, withered over the next century. Why build a workshop in Castile when the silver let you simply buy the finished product from abroad? The treasure hollowed out the very industries that make a country durably rich, and it did it quietly, one price rise at a time, while everyone was looking at the galleons. A Spanish writer named Martín González de Celerigo saw it happening in real time. In 1600 he published a pamphlet arguing that his country had grown poor precisely because it had grown rich, that the flood of precious metal had corrupted the nation's capacity to actually produce anything. He didn't have the term, but he was describing what economists now call the resource curse, and he was describing it 400 years before we gave it a name. Now the honest part, because the tidy version of this story is also wrong, just in the opposite direction. If you've heard this tale before, you've probably heard it as, silver caused inflation, inflation ruined Spain, the end. It's cleaner than the truth. Look closely at Hamilton's own data, and a problem jumps out. Prices in Spain started climbing around 1516 to 1520. Serious quantities of American silver didn't arrive until after the Potosi and Zacatecas strikes of the mid-1540s. In the 1520s, almost none came in at all. The inflation had a running start before the treasure showed up, which means silver cannot be the whole story. Population growth was pushing prices up too. So was the copper coinage the crown later abused. And there's a deeper fight among historians about whether Spain's bankruptcies prove anything was wrong at all. For decades, the standard reading, associated with the great French historian Fernand Braudel, was that Philip's finances were hopeless, and only foolish bankers kept lending into the fire. Then, in 2010, two economists, Mauricio Drelichman and Hans Joachim Voth, went back into the archives with new data and argued something startling. Philip II's debts were actually sustainable. His government ran real surpluses. His defaults were short-term liquidity crises, cash stuck on a delayed fleet, not the death spiral of an insolvent state. By their measure, 16th century Castile's public finances compared favorably with other great powers of the era, including England. That doesn't rescue Spain's long-run story. The 17th century really was a slow disaster, but it should make you suspicious of anyone who tells you a bankrupt empire is a simple morality tale. The people running Spanish finance were not idiots and not cartoon villains. They were competent administrators making rational choices inside a trap, and the trap was partly built out of their own good fortune. In the 17th century, the machine finally ground down. The silver coin had always been Spain's one point of pride. Unlike most European rulers, who quietly shaved the metal out of their currency to cheat their creditors, the Spanish kept their silver and gold coinage honest for most of the 1500s. Then, in 1599, the new King Philip III started minting a coin made of pure copper called vellon. It let the treasury conjure money out of cheap metal and pocket the difference. It also poured fuel on the inflation. The crown promised the Cortes it would stop. It didn't. Waves of copper kept coming. Across the ocean, even the mountain's reputation cracked. In the 1630s, a corruption scandal at the Potosi mint revealed that the coins themselves had been debased, silver quietly diluted, and bankers in Genoa and merchants as far away as Mughal India began rejecting Potosi money. The mint's proud P mark, once a stamp of the richest silver on earth, became slang for poison. And the human arithmetic underneath it all was collapsing. Between roughly 1590 and 1650, the population of Castile fell by close to a quarter, hit by plague, war, and emigration. The tax system made it worse. Spain's nobility, the hidalgos, paid no taxes, and being a nobleman was a status you could claim, so people claimed it. By 1700, something like 1 in 5 men in Castile asserted noble rank to dodge the tax collector, which meant the whole burden fell on the shrinking number of commoners still working, through levies like a punishing sales tax on ordinary trade. A country sitting on the world's silver was taxing its poorest people into the ground. Here is the image that makes the whole thing land. In September 1628, off the coast of Cuba in the Bay of Matanzas, a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein caught an entire Spanish treasure fleet. The Spanish ships were so overloaded with silver that their crews couldn't even work the guns properly, and they surrendered with almost no fighting. Hein took 177,537 pounds of silver, plus gold, indigo, and cochineal. Counting the coins took days. The haul was worth about 11.5 million guilders, roughly half the annual budget of the entire Dutch Republic, and it went straight into paying the soldiers fighting Spain. The Dutch West India Company handed its shareholders a 50% dividend that year. There's a small human detail I can't get out of my head. Hein spoke to the captured Spanish sailors in fluent Spanish, because years earlier he had been a Spanish galley slave himself. And of the 11.5 million guilders, he personally received about 7,000. Even the man who stole the treasure barely touched it. That was the pattern for everyone in this story. The silver passed through your hands and went somewhere else. So what actually happened here? Not a conspiracy. No secret group engineered Spain's ruin. The bankers were lenders, doing what lenders do, and they were often the ones left holding worthless paper when the crown defaulted. The kings weren't fools. There was no villain in a back room. The antagonist in this story is a force, not a person. The strange, counterintuitive way that a sudden flood of easy money can rot the thing it lands on. And the crude version, silver equals doom, isn't right either. The silver bought Spain a century as the most powerful state on earth. It funded armies, cathedrals, an empire that stretched around the globe. The problem wasn't that the treasure existed. The problem was what it let Spain avoid doing. Because the money arrived without being earned, the crown could fight endless wars it couldn't afford, borrow against ships that hadn't sailed, and skip the slow work of building industries and a tax system that actually functioned. The silver was spent on soldiers and debt service instead of invested in the country. When the mines slowed, nothing was left underneath. The final irony is the one worth sitting with. The powers that ended up rich from the age of silver were the ones without a silver mountain. England and the Dutch Republic, who had to earn their money through trade and manufacturing and cheaper credit, built the institutions that carried them into the modern world. Spain, handed the greatest fortune in history, was overtaken by its own customers. The mountain is still there. It's been mined for nearly 5 centuries, and it's structurally hollow now, sinking, still worked by people scraping a living from what's left. The coins it produced gave the world the word dollar and the shape of modern money. Almost none of that wealth stayed in the country that dug it up. Spain found the greatest treasure in history, held it for 200 years, and let it run through its fingers the entire time. If you made it this far, drop a piece of 8 in the comments, and 8, so I know you stuck around to the end. And if the money behind history is the thing you actually want more of, subscribe, because this channel goes deep on exactly this: the ledgers under the legends. I'll see you in the next one.